So I guess I'm going to talk to this side of the room because, if I look at the weighting between the halves of the room, everybody's over here. No, I'm teasing. No, so thank you all. Thank you, Chelsea, for that introduction on what that is. I just want to spend a few minutes talking to you today about incident response. So I have a question for the room just to kind of start out, and I'm not going to ask for, who's had their company hacked. That's a little strong of an opening. But I would like to ask, how many people in here have dealt with either in a family member, in their business, in another business, have been impacted by an attack, a ransomware attack, something like that inside of a business that's maybe shut that down and provide a problem? So a few people scared of that, of raising their hands. Yeah. No, so it's really interesting when you look at it, because when you look at incident response, everybody likes to think about the glamour, the things that happen when we start talking about security and the problems of it and everything else, or they go to the other side, which is a guy like me gets up with a presentation, throws 1,000 stats at you about how the world is going to die due to cybersecurity, and we give you all the stats, but really don't talk about anything practical to really go about how you can really action on that and what it looks like. So I want to talk today a little bit. I'm going to make this a little interactive, so prepare yourselves. We're going to talk and share a little bit as we go through it and talk about a little bit what's going on. So Chelsea did a great job introducing me, so I'm not going to go through a lot here. I just want to tell you a couple of things about what I do today. So I manage a team of about 180 people that are located around the world, where what we do is we watch the systems of small, medium businesses around the world today. So I have partners like Pearson-Kelly who are located all over the place that have customers that we watch, we protect, and we're watching for threats and attacks. Out of that, we help stop attacks, we help walk through problems, we help them go through those things, but at the same time, we also have the cases where real stuff happens, real problems, real things happen, and you have to be able to respond and walk to that and be able to handle it. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about what you need to know about incident response, what that means, how you prepare. Because the truth is whether you have a team that does it for yourself, whether you partner with a team like Pearson-Kelly, whatever, to be able to do with that, you still have to deal with it. Doesn't matter how it is, because and if I think about some of the stats last year, and I'm going to throw up a few things here for just a second. Last year, and these are put together by a multitude of different industries. I can show you all sorts of different stats on them. But last year, if you look worldwide, about 56% of all businesses were impacted one way or another just by ransomware. Now, when I talk about hacking, when I talk about attacks, when I talk about things like that, ransomware is really only one type. We focus on it because everybody sees it, right? When it happens, it shuts down the world. We see all those things, but it really is only one type of the attacks that happen and what's going on. We can also look and see that with the growth of IoT devices, and for those who don't know, I'm talking about the things like in your house, that your thermostat that sits up there, right? It hooks to a network. You might be able to control that from your phone and change the temperature. In your businesses, you may have things that are sitting there, your cameras, all sorts of different things that are sitting there connected in one way or another to a network, but they're not your computer that you're working on every day. Those are IoT devices, Internet of Things. But all of those are becoming a different attack point that the attackers can get into and attack, because they're all talking to different things and using different pieces. And most of our technology is not set up to really watch what's going on those things and what they are. We've all seen the adoption of cloud-based services. Anybody have email in the cloud right now? Now, I'm going to get more people to raise their hands here. I'm going to work on that, because I guarantee you that 99% of this room uses email in the cloud somewhere. Thank you. So when we really start to look at it, right, that has really brought in a whole nother piece, because when everything existed in your business, you theoretically, and I'm going to say it that way, had full control over what your risks were. Now, I would argue that's probably not a true statement, but people believed it, right? As long as it was in your four doors of your building, you had full control of whether you exposed something or didn't. Well, as soon as I step outside to the cloud, do I have full control? What's that vendor doing? What does that look like? What are those different pieces? And you have to understand what those things are. Now, can I say that I don't want to work with the cloud? Well, in today's day and age, no. The cost difference and what's happening and the economies of scale that you get from working with the cloud make it, in many cases, a risk that we choose to take because of the benefit of what's there. But we have to understand that and evaluate that in our business. And then lastly, AI. So we talk about artificial intelligence, right? And we talk about that, and just as a funny joke, my daughter is pre-vet, so it came up in our house the other day that AI doesn't always mean artificial intelligence. It can also mean artificial insemination, which was a whole different thing from a cybersecurity standpoint. And she was like, yeah, we talked about AI today. And I'm like, yeah, you're not in computer science. What are you talking about AI for? And so either way, it's just a funny side joke. But either way, so from an AI standpoint, it's not only being used by us. So in our businesses, you may have different tools or different vendors that bring you things that help you automate what's going on and learn from it and help you be more efficient as you go through it. Well, guess what? The attackers are doing the same thing. And the speed with which they're able to move through your network, the speed with which they're able to take an announcement of a new vulnerability and turn that into an attack that runs on your business can be done in seconds or minutes as they go through it now, not waiting for, oh, I see that vulnerability, now it's a month down the road. So the world has really changed as we start seeing what that is and going through it. So what does that mean for us? Right, I put SMBs up there. Now, I will say this. It's always funny when you talk about small, medium businesses. If I go to Gartner, which is one of the sources talking about IT stuff and where that is and rating different pieces, Gartner would define a small, medium business as any business less than $1 billion. So that's a pretty broad range, right, when we start going through it, right? So, but when you talk about small, medium businesses and we look at the challenges that are in there and where they are, we can run through a few different things, right? So we've got a lot of confusion. If I say cybersecurity and asked all of you to define what I meant by that, all of you would probably have a slightly different definition, have a different thing you think of when you start looking at that and how you manage it, and also who's responsible for it. If I was to actually tell you that, if you're a business owner in here today, you own the data, you're responsible for the cybersecurity. You may use your IT person in your company or the company you work with, like Pearson-Kelly, to be able to do that. But you're still the data owner. You still own that, right? That's called the data responsibility pie. In my world, we have lots of training we do for different organizations on what that means and what it looks like. But who owns it? We can talk about the difficulty to manage it, right? Having the right tools, understanding what we do and how we train. I'll tell you it's not up here, one of the biggest challenges that we see today is finding talented people, right? We start looking in all of our businesses right now, post-COVID, right? Hiring is a challenge, right? And it's finding people to be able to walk through that and do that. And then down at the bottom, the increased costs of being able to deal with it and respond to it. So there's a lot of different things that lead up to what that is and what it looks like. So I want to start in the basic. When we start talking about incident response, and this is where I'm going to get a little interactive here as we start walking through this and go through it. So the first thing I'm going to throw up real quick is what is an event? And I'm going to start very basic because if we have to come to an agreement on this to understand some of the other things around incident response. And an event is any observable occurrence of something that happens on your company network. So if I run through it, that means anything, good, bad, otherwise it doesn't matter. But an adverse event is anything negative that happens in that process. So I think from a basic standpoint, we're all there as you start looking at it. But now what I want to do is I want to actually come back and define what a security incident is. And so it's a little bit longer definition, but this is going to be interesting. It says a violation or imminent threat of violation of computer security policies, acceptable use policies, and standard security practices. Now I have a question for you. What does that assume about your business? If you read that definition about a security incident, what is it assuming? That you have the policies. Because if you don't have the policies, I can't define what an incident is. And that's really important. Because some incidents are obvious. Somebody clicks on a phishing link, right? I can go through a whole list, and I'm just going to throw them up here on the next slide. I can go through a whole list of all sorts of different things that could be a security incident. But when you look up here on this list, for instance, I'm going to go to the bottom one. A user exposes sensitive information on social or sharing sites. Well, is that a security incident? Well, if I haven't defined a policy that says what is sensitive data, and I haven't actually said how that should be treated inside my business, I can't determine whether or not it's a security incident. So you're going to see all the way through here when I talk about incident response. So much of it is understanding what you have, where you have, and then putting the pieces in place to be able to protect it and walk through it. So you need the policies, you need the things that define how you're going to handle things. Also up here, you can see a user gives out information to a client, on a client to a caller on the phone thinking they're authorized. Well, where's the policies that define how you determine who's authorized, what that looks like, all those things. But obviously, if you hand it out to the wrong person, it's a security incident. Now, notice neither one of those things I brought up just then is about a hacker hacking into your network, getting control of it, stealing data, going through all that. Those are obviously security incidents. And obviously, from an incident response standpoint, those are very important, but it's broader. And I want you to understand that when you start talking about incident response, it's much broader than what you think of when you just think of theft, or we think about those things and what they look like. So let's talk about developing an incident response plan and kind of what the things are. So let me ask a question first. All of us, how many people in here have some kind of a disaster response plan? Not security, just a disaster response plan in your business. Fire happens, something goes on, tornado, different things happen in there. You have a plan, from an insurance company, how you're going to work with them, what those things look like, be able to make the decision and manage that, and who inside your company deals with it. Well, incident response is a very similar conversation. But the thing is to be aware is, I don't know what the exact stats are, but if you look at it, what are the odds that a tornado would hit your building? Well, out here in Springfield, it might be a little higher than, say, it might be in the Northeast or somewhere else, but generally speaking, it's still pretty low, right? If I look at those kinds of things, or a fire was going to burn it down, or those pieces. Well, if I was to tell you that from a cybersecurity incident, from a ransomware incident, there's a new ransomware attack happening somewhere in the world every 11 seconds. So when you start understanding that, it starts meaning that from a disaster recovery standpoint, this conversation is as important and a risk to your business as those other conversations about how you deal with fire. What's in the plan? So an incident response plan refers to the organized approach to addressing and managing the aftermath of a cybersecurity attack, a data breach. So it's making sure that you know what you're going to do when that happens and walk through it. So let me ask the next question. And if you feel uncomfortable answering the question, that's fine, but I'm going to ask the questions because it makes it more interesting. How many of you have, to some degree, and it could be very simple or it could be very major, but an actual incident response plan around security in your business today? So a quarter of the room, right? And that's not unusual, right? So if you didn't raise your hand, don't feel uncomfortable because that's normal, right? It's a different process, and it's something that most businesses haven't walked through, and we start really going to it and start seeing what it is. So it's something that's tangible that we can look at. So when I say that an incident response plan, it says on here it's well documented, it's there. It's actually something I can put my hands on. It's not just, we talked about it and we have a plan. It's something we can actually execute and walk through. So why is it important, right? So let me give you an example. When a football team walks out on a field, any football fans in here? So again, I've got liars in the room. You all are just afraid to raise your hand, right? Trust me, there's more football fans in here. But either way, so when we start looking at it from an incident response standpoint, right? So football fans, right? So they go out and practice on the practice field. Why do they practice? Anybody know? Yeah. So they practice so when they go out in the game, right? They don't have to think about what they're doing. They can go adjust to what the other team is doing, but not have to worry about the fundamentals. They don't have to worry about the same things. The quarterback's not thinking, well, how do I throw that ball again? The wide receiver's not thinking about, well, if they call this play, I need to run 15 steps, cut left, and then go and then run for the end zone, right? They're not having to think about that stuff. That stuff's ingrained in them. They've walked through it. They've practiced it. They know what they're going to do. Well, when we start talking about incident response, it's the same conversation. You can't, trust me, you don't have time. You cannot get into an incident response situation in your business and have an attack happen. And I'm going to tell you some stories in a minute, and we're going to walk through some things. But we have an attack happen and then go, okay, now what? If you say, now what, you already lost. And yeah, you may recover, right? But trust me, the cost is going up by the second as we start walking through that story and what it looks like. So putting a plan in place is really about knowing what to do, how to execute on it, and how to prepare as we go through it. So let's talk for just a second about some of the areas that make up an incident response plan. So first of all, it's made up of your policies, your plans, and your procedures. The three areas that are really important when we start looking about how to build it, how to put those things in place and understanding what they are. So let's talk about policies first. So what is a policy? So your policies are your agreement to what does I'm going to say it this way, what does the plan need to include? It's not the plan itself. It's you sitting, your stakeholders of your business sitting and saying, I need to make sure that when we start executing on these things, these are the things it has to entail. It has to cover these. We have an agreement that these are the policies we're going to operate by. And I've got some different examples up here on the screen. The organizational structure. Let me give you an example. When you run through a normal disaster recovery experience today, how many of you have somebody in your organization that has to say, I agree that's a disaster, we're going to initiate our disaster recovery plan? Anybody in your disaster recovery? So I've got hands there. Why is that important? Anybody know? So here would be my opinion. I used to help companies plan disaster recovery plans as we go through it. That's important because oftentimes your disaster recovery plans have the right and the permission to spend budget to do different things. Sometimes people may operate in different roles in the business during a disaster than they run inside of their normal operations. I mean, during a disaster, if a fire happens in the business, your controller of your business may stand up and have a different job. His job may be to get everybody out of the building. It's not about being the controller at that moment. It's about doing something else. It may be somebody else's job to be standing outside counting the people that come out to make sure that I've got them out of the building. There can be a lot of different things. I can also maybe have a budget that I've set aside for disaster that I can spend, but somebody has to declare that the disaster has happened to make those decisions important. So incident response is the same way. You have to have a structure for how I'm going to organize my team when a disaster happens. What does that look like? What roles are they filling? Do I have vendors that are helping me in that moment? What are they? What are the phone numbers I need to call when I get into that process, right? It's defining that I know and agree on how I'm going to manage it when we look at it. It's also things like severity ratings. There's not every disaster is the same, right? Somebody clicking on a phishing email that may have had their password stolen to their favorite gaming site, as long as they aren't using the same password everywhere. Conversation for another day. But as long as they're not doing something like that, right, it may be a low severity issue, right? It might have been some site that they used for business for a different purpose, but it wasn't your banking site. Okay, so we have something we need to execute. We need to respond to it, but it's not a big emergency. But that's different than finding out that somebody's hacked into your network and they're sitting on a server and they've been stealing data for 30 days. And what does that mean? It's a very different conversation when we start seeing what that is and being able to handle the severities of them. And then also the requirements of standard reporting and contact forms. This is something, this is not the forms themselves. I'm going to talk about those when we get to something else. But, predefining forms, this is something I do with my incident response teams as an example. Predefining the forms that are going to be used during an incident is really important. You don't want somebody, you send somebody out and you tell them it's a problem and they sit down, you want them to document what's going on, and they make up on the fly how they're going to do it. Well, that means if you sent 5 people out and they were all collecting supposedly the same information, they're going to come back with 5 different formats of the information, probably some of them missing the information you wanted, and then you're going to have to go out and collect it again. So it's about making sure you think through those things and define the need for them and put those things in place. Now, when we talk about plans, the plan is the actual, how do I get from A to B? What are the steps that I'm going to do when I'm going to walk through it? I'm going to execute that plan, build it based on the policies I put in place. Make sure that I live according to the tenets of what I said I was going to do as I go through it and put those plans together. But it is an actionable, tangible plan. Do A, do B, I'm walking through it, here's who I contact, here's what I need to do, and we're going to talk about some of those points here in just a second and why it's so important. And then lastly, the procedures. These are the actual steps. You need somebody to go out in an incident response case, and I have some systems that have been encrypted, and let's say that I need for insurance purposes to save the hard drives. Somebody needs to know how to that they need to do that they need to go take the drives out of the computer, go to the store, buy drives to put back in there to walk through that, rebuild the computer, and what does that process look like? This is the step 1, the step 2, the exact things to walk through to make sure that your team, every time as you walk through it, can execute those things over and over and over again the same way. The same way, if any of you are in manufacturing or anything else, right? If you don't have the actual procedures and have the actual pieces done, then what is your team that's out there building something going to do? You're going to deliver a lot of different parts that look very different every single time you do them, right? So you have to have that defined and be able to walk through it. So last thing, and I'm going to get into some examples here, that is so critical and important. So when we talk about cybersecurity, and this is true for anything in your business, but this is the piece to me that gets overlooked too often, right? There's two groups in the business that tend to look at cybersecurity a little different. So you have your technicians who are geeked out, who want the next tool that they can get, and how can I use that to help me have fun and do the best thing and be able to respond and protect the business and walk through all those things as quick as possible. But generally speaking, those technicians are not worried about the price tag. How many of you are business owners and the price tag is somewhat important to determining whether or not you implement something? Yeah, I got a few hands back there as we start looking at it, right? So what you have to do is you have to evaluate risk, right? When I start looking at it, it's what's the real risk to my business? If an incident happens, how long am I down? What can I do? I mean, when you all look at risks in your business, I know in your other areas, I'm sure your disaster recovery plans, anybody look at the fact of how long can you be down, what's the cost to the business, the amount of time you're down, and what do you do based on the length of the problem? Y'all do that in your disaster recovery plans as you kind of walk through that? Got a few nods. I will get you all to talk before this is over. I'm going to pull this out. But in either case, right? But there's definite pieces about being able to make those decisions and walk through them as we see it. So the same thing is true about cybersecurity, right? You've got to look at risk and determine what the cost is for that risk, right? Some things you might be willing to take the risk on. You don't want to spend the money. You don't want to do something and figure that. But you need to look at that and make a business decision, not just ignore it. And I think that's too often when we get into cybersecurity, people choose to ignore it thinking it will never be me. And I see those every day. I always joke that incident response is 1/2 technical and 1/2 therapy. Because when we get into incident response and we help companies with what it is, as much as coaching is as much of what we do as anything else. It's helping people calm down. It's helping people look at a situation logically and then make right decisions as they walk through it. Because the emotional decision oftentimes in these is not the right path. And it gets dangerous when you start going down those paths and what they look like and seeing what they are. So when we start talking about executive buy-in, I say this about both incident response and about things like security awareness training or stuff like that. You as a business owner, as a stakeholder in your business, need to build the culture of security of what that is. Because if your team, if your people don't believe that it's important to you and don't believe that you're engaged and understand what it is, trust me, they're not going to put the time and effort and understand what the process is and the pieces to be able to really support that and go through it. So when we look at it, it's so critical of making sure that just like any other plan, that you have executive buy-in in what's being done and they have engagement in that process. That may be you, that may be somebody you report to, but it's making sure they're engaged in the process and what it looks like. And making sure that you have a real culture of what that is. Because the first piece of incident response to me is preparation, and I'm going to talk about that. And when you start looking at preparation, the first piece is making sure that your team is aware of the challenges, understand with them, and engaged with you to be able to. Then so much the better. I have a much better case for what that is. So you need to make sure you have that in place. So when we look at incident response planning, and I've got up on the board, NIST, if you're not familiar with them, is a national institute that creates standards for the government for things that are happening. And they have one around incident response. This is their model that's up on the board. And it's a really good model when we start looking at it and what to do. So we start off with preparation and planning. We move into detection and analysis. And I'm not going to, we're not doing a deep dive. We're not going to go into this technically into all the detail. I'm giving you a high-level picture of what it is. We move into containment, eradication, and recovery. And then lastly, we get into post-incident analysis. So it really is understanding what that is. Now, here's the challenge. There is a specific order to that, and that's there for a purpose. See these little arrows? That's where certain things might have to be repeated in the process as I go through it. For instance, I might detect something in an environment and start responding and investigating it and seeing what's happening. I might move into starting to lock down and protect the environment, but then learn something else, and I need to do more detection and more investigation as we go through it. So as we break these down, I want to start with the basics as we start looking at the front end on incident response. So the first piece is preparation. And when you start talking about preparation, it's true in anything. To protect anything in your business, you have to know what you have. So I'm going to step on toes today. That's my job because I'm not with Pearson-Kelly, so I can step on toes and walk through this. You know, if I was to ask how many of you actually have documented every technical asset you have in a building, and if I was to walk with you to your team and ask for a list of this, how many of you all think you have a team that could actually give you that right now? So about third, half of the room on where we are. A few people want to think it. They're trying to decide, do we really have it as we go through it, right? You know, I'll tell you in incident response cases when I see problems, almost 90% of the ones that turn to the point that we have real issues all start with they don't know what they have. Because if you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. I can't put the right things in place to do to be able to keep the bad guy out. Because it was there. If I was to tell you, if I use the house example, which some of you we use inside ConnectWise all the time, you know, the security system example. But if I was to look at the first floor of a building and say I'm doing awesome, I have alarms on 5 of my windows, but I actually have 6 windows. So not going to work really well to protect the house. I have to know what's there to be able to protect it. So when we talk about incident response, even in responding after something, the speed to be able to respond is driven so much by knowing what already exists and what that is. Otherwise, I have to figure it out. Visibility. When we start looking at what's there, the tools that are already in place inside of a network are so important. My IR teams, when we get involved with a case and when we see it, you know, first thing I want to know is what's there and what's been documented about that network, what happened on it. If there's no tools that are in there, I'm discovering and having to spend time trying to ferret out and determine what's happened on that network. If I have actual logging and things that give us visibility in what's there, oftentimes we might be able to determine what's going on in minutes and figure out a path to go it. But without any tools, without any visibility, you're then having to install things. I'm having to start looking. I'm looking after the fact on what was done. I mean, if you look at a bank that's robbed, right? If a bank is robbed and I had cameras in there filming the guys that are doing the robbing, well, guess what? I know immediately what happened and who stole it. May not have matched up their picture to something, but I'm trying to figure that out, right? On what's there. But if I have no cameras, if I have no documentation, if I have nothing that's there, what do I do after the bank is robbed? Well, now I have to start asking people. I might get 5 different definitions of what the guy looked like that did it. I might have, you know, all these different pieces that I have to weed through to find the truth as we look at it. Build your plans. So making sure you build the plan, which is what we're here about today from an incident response planning standpoint. And then lastly, practice. When you start talking about incident response plans and those kinds of things, even if it goes horrible, you need to do what we call a tabletop exercise, which is run through your plan, pretend that something happened, and make sure that everything you intended to happen worked the way you thought it should. I mean, how many people have a generator and you spin it up once a month to make sure it's really going to power your building, right? There's a reason for that, because when it really all goes wrong, you want to make sure it's going to turn on when you turn it on, and make sure you go through that process. So order of response. And this is where it gets really interesting to me, and you know, it gets psychological too. So when you respond to an incident, it's so important that you do it in the right order. So I showed you that order a minute ago and what's there. If you've ever been through an incident, as I said, an incident is very emotional, right? It's an attack. Most business owners take it very personal, right? Their livelihood's on the line, things are happening, potentially it's shutting down their business. You can't serve your customers that you've promised what it is. And every business owner wants to do what when they're taken down by an attack? Anybody know what they want to do when they're taken down by an attack?
Spin back up.
Get back up. That's their one goal. That's everything it is. The problem is if you don't know how the attack happened, you could spin back up and be right back in the same case or worse the next day, a day later, whatever, or come back up, think everything's good, and guess what? Now they're still in there stealing data. and they're going on with whatever it is. So you have to walk through incident response in the right order. And when we go through it with companies, part of that is sitting there and saying, guys, I know you want to turn everything back on, but we have to pause. And we have to do the investigation, because if we don't do the investigation, trust me, you're going to be calling me back again. You're going to be mad at me that I didn't solve the problem. But two, you're going to realize the cost of the business just multiplied many times because of what it is. And you have to go through the process and what it is. So it really is about first detection and being able to explain what's happening. Then containing. And sometimes you do those a little bit together, but be able to potentially, if you can identify where the attack's coming from, stop their ability to do anything worse than's already happened. Then you, as you go through it, you start them remediating. And lastly, after you've done that, then you recover. And recover can mean a lot of different things as to what that means to the business. Sometimes recovery, depending on the attack, can be done in a few hours and you're back up and running. Sometimes recovery is staged. I might have to bring up critical parts of your business just to get you operating. Then I may have to go to larger parts of your business, and it may take a month or 2 months to get a business back up into full operation like they were before an incident, depending on what's going on. But the key is making sure you walk through that with a critical eye to what's going on. And like it says up here, the pressure will always be to skip recovery. And your attorneys may also agree with skipping recovery. I was on a call with a company just 2 weeks ago that ran through a significant case, took down their whole business. They provide some stuff to the government, so it was a pretty serious issue. There was a lot going on. And they had their attorneys on the phone trying to figure out what they could do without getting sued, what those pieces would be. And their attorneys on the call were saying, hey, turn it back on. And we basically had to get to the point of asking the attorneys which ones of them were incident response experts, because none of them were. But they were all under pressure again because their bills were being paid by the company. They wanted to get them back up and running, and so looking at it. So it's really important to make sure that you pause and you really think through the process of what's going. And then lastly, at the bottom there, is assumption. This is where expertise really comes in. The natural intent when you start getting into an attack is always to try to assume how the attack happened. And when I say assume, I mean it's anything other than being able to prove it. Right? It's the same thing as, we typically don't like to assume who did something and then throw them in jail on an assumption. We have an entire process that we, innocent until proven guilty. We have them go in front of a jury of their peers. We go through that whole process, right, and have a court process. Well, it's the same thing here. You don't want to assume, because what happens with you when you assume? When you assume, you see an attack, you go, oh, they did it from that computer. So if I shut that computer off, guess what? We're safe. We can go ahead and keep operating. Only to find out that somebody else hooked up something else the other day, or some port was open in your firewall, or there's all these other things that can happen. And without proof and understanding, you're going to end up in a mess and not know why it happened and not be able to control and recover it when you start going through it. So from a recovery standpoint, how many people in here, and there's not a wrong answer to this, there's a lot of interesting discussions here, but how many people in here actually work with or have either a rider on your insurance policy that says that it covers cyber incidents, or you have a separate cyber incident policy, something like that? Right? So the majority of the room when you do it. Has anybody noticed recently or tried to do a re-up of your insurance policy recently and noticed that it's not quite so simple? Anybody noticed that recently? Yeah, it's like a whole different world. I mean, how many people know that the insurance companies have taken a bath in the last 2 years around insurance? And the insurance industry is one of the oldest industries in the world, right? This is the new infant thing, regardless if they've been doing cyber insurance now for 10 years or so. But that's still brand new in the insurance industry, and they're still trying to figure it out and figure out what it works. But for people who have been with it, let me ask a question. If anybody's tried to do it, what have you noticed that's different? What was that?
2 times the cost.
Yeah, 2 times the cost. Yeah, the costs have definitely gone up. Anything else?
Yeah, a lot of questions.
A lot of questions. They give you this whole thing to fill out, right? And it's asking, do you do this? And do you do that? And, what are you doing around this? And guess what? I've seen some interesting ones. I've seen ones that actually go to a field and ask you which software tools you have in certain areas, and don't assume that on the drop down there that they have on everything to fill out that everything is an okay answer. Because I've found out by talking to some of the insurance carriers that if you check this one, this one, and this one, it's an automatic decline. But if you do this one, this one, and this one, then they'll let you go on to the next thing. So it's really interesting when you start seeing what's happening because they're trying to evaluate risk. And they've got all the data. They're looking and saying, hey, guess what? So if you had this, oh, you have all these things, well, that means our risk is this. Oh, but if you had this, guess what? 90% of the cases we dealt with, they also had that, and we lost money in every one of those cases. So they're seeing all the pieces and what that looks like and what it is. So you have to be able to answer the questions up here before you can really take actions. You have to know the source. You have to know where things are coming from, what the different pieces are, and really be able to drive that as you start looking at it and understanding it. Because if you don't, I'll give you a good example. I dealt with an actual attack a few months ago in an organization. Organization had about 400 employees that did it, and they went through, able to get anything back. Everything was encrypted. They couldn't figure out what to do with it. They were stuck, couldn't do it. We came in, we started investigating in their environment. And they're like, well, we're sure that it happened because we changed vendors in this one vendor, and they made some changes to our network and what it was, and we're sure that's why this happened. Well, it turns out when we investigated the attack and we got into it, their attack had actually started a year and a half before. The attacker had been in the network well over 300 days. They'd been inside the environment. They had perused all the wonderful information. They'd stolen all sorts of data on this network, and they got in because a technician went in and opened a port on a firewall a year and a half before for a vendor who wanted to do some testing on something, forgot about it, and then afterwards didn't come back and close down the thing that they opened. They left it open to the internet. Bad guys found it. They came in, and then they just sat there and learned and stole and did things. And it wasn't until a year and a half later, this was on Christmas Day, that they decided to run the attack and actually encrypt the network because they figured, we can't get any more data out of it. So there's no more money there, so now let's encrypt it and let's ask them for money and see if we can get a few more dollars out of them before that's done. But it really is understand why it happens, because so much of it is understanding that. Another piece of that attack that was really interesting, so they didn't have any backups. You know why? Well, they had all their backups just in their local network. None of it was taken off site, none of it was out in the cloud, so that was one problem. The second piece is the attackers were in the network long enough that they'd also hacked into the backup system. And they looked at it and they realized they have 3 months of backups. So they had all these different pieces that were in there. They had 3 months of iterations of their backup that they could run. And the attackers knew that. So they didn't turn off the backups. What they did is they logged in, they unchecked the little boxes that said what's going to be backed up, and left a few little files being backed up. So every day, the IT guys were still seeing the nice little green check mark saying your backups are working. The challenge was they weren't checking all the different things that were necessary, so as a result, the backups kept being smaller and smaller and smaller, and then finally after 3 months when they didn't have any backups left that were before that date, that was when the attack launched. So again, when I talk about an attacker being smart, these aren't kids sitting in their garage anymore. These are real businesses that make financial steps, have plans to make their business succeed, which is attacking you, stealing things, and going through that. And so we have to deal with it as a real business when we start looking at it. So let me ask you another question, because I've seen this happen. One of the other pieces that's really important when we get into incident response is how we handle communications. So let me ask you a question. Many of you work in different businesses, different industries, different things. If you had a cyber attack happen on your business, and someone in your company was there when it happened, and you never know, by the way, when something like this happens, who might show up at your door. Because someone at your business may know somebody who's a politician, or someone at your business may know somebody who's a reporter, or a blogger, or different things, and all of a sudden you get somebody to show up that just wants to talk about the attack that just happened on your business that you haven't even figured out which ends up, but guess what? Other people are already aware of it. If that person showed up at the door, regardless of where they came from, news, politician, whatever, and said, hey, what's going on? And you had an employee standing at that front door, it doesn't matter which one, do you know what that employee would say? Are there very many of you that know what that employee would say? Yeah, truth is, most people don't. You're in the majority, right? The problem is what that employee says can be so important, because let's say that person does walk to the front and says, oh, we were, say you're a medical business, and that walks up there, and the person sitting at the front desk, checking people in, and somebody says, oh, I just heard that you all had an attack. What's going on? Oh, I don't know. All our systems are encrypted. We got these messages on our computer that said they stole all our data. What are we going to do? Oh, great. So from a HIPAA standpoint, you just told everybody that all your data was taken. It's published. You don't have control of it anymore. So right now, we just exacerbated the conversation of what that is. That's just medical, right? I can go to any other industry and talk about your reputation, what that looks like, and what it is. So how you handle communication and messaging and train your teams around this type of information is so important. Pulling your teams together beforehand, this is part of the plans, and helping them know that, hey, if we have an incident, here's what you're allowed to say, here's what you're not allowed to say. How many people, take a sheriff's department, right? Most sheriff's departments have spokespeople, right? And when something happens in an environment, maybe the sheriff says something, but you don't generally see the beat cop on the corner making the statement to the press. You don't normally see all those things happening. You see that press person standing up there. They're trained on how to handle it and what that is. Why? Because they know what they can say. They know what they can't say. They know what's important. Well, you need to be doing the same thing around your messaging, around these kinds of issues, so that you know what that person that answers that door will say. And just an example of what you can train them is the statement I've got up there. We are unable to respond to that question until we complete our investigation, right? And then direct them to whoever can speak. It's not about providing more information, because people get into one of two things happen when people get approached by things like that. They either get pride wells up within them and they're like, oh, I have to know an answer, or they're just scared to death and they just start spewing anything they can think of at the moment, right? So you have to arm them with knowing what to say ahead of time so that you can expect it and what it is. Walk them through these three things. What should you say? What should you not say? And then how to talk about it, and the fact that, how you handle that conversation. Because it's so important as you walk through it. How many of you have a plan in place that says when a cyber incident happens, that the first thing you do is call your insurance company? Would you call your insurance company immediately when something happens? I got some quasi nods going on. Well, what if I were to tell you that most of your insurance policies say out there that they won't cover anything that happens before you call them? And most of them have very defined statements that if you don't respond to an incident in a certain way, they won't cover it. So you have to call them, you have to notify them, put them on notice that you might have something. Otherwise, you might as well not have that insurance policy. So it's also a very important thing when you start looking through those things and you start handling communication, what that is. So let's talk about effective messaging. How many people have ever been around politics? So I got some good hands in there, right? Politicians are great at this. They may not say anything worthwhile, but they are great at this when you start going through it, right? So, sound bites. Why do people use sound bites? We make fun of them. We talk about them all the time, but it's not stopping people. They still use the sound bites to talk. Why? Because they're effective. People remember them. People think about the thing, because the attention span that we bring in is so important. Well, it's the same thing when we start messaging. So as you have people who can respond, decide what the point is you want to get across, and just keep saying that thing. You don't start into a discussion, because again, you don't know what you don't know. You don't provide information you don't know. We don't provide information we don't have proof for. We have to make sure we understand what those things are as we get into those things, and make sure that we keep it succinct, to the point, cover our things, and then it's not wrong to say, just like they do in the media, we're done taking questions, right? It sounds funny when I say it, right? Because how many of you really end up in that? But I'll tell you a perfect example. We had a partner who had a customer that happened to be a nonprofit, doesn't matter where, but a nonprofit that they did work for, that got hit with a cyber incident. They sent one of their technicians out, and a blogger was literally sitting at the front door before they got there to ask what was going on, because somebody in that company knew them and said, hey, you're into this tech stuff. We have something going on. That blogger had already called the state senator, because it was a nonprofit that was pretty well known. You all would know the name if I said it. I'm not going to say it. That was in there, and they had the politicians were literally in the car on the way and were already calling the owner of the nonprofit. So again, nobody had investigated anything other than the ransomware messages in this particular case that were on the computers. Nobody knew anything, and yet the technician got there and started bringing the blogger into the building with them as they were doing their investigation and letting them help them. So again, you have to have communication. You have to understand how to talk about it and what those things are. And then lastly, post-incident activity. So there's no value to any process unless you learn from it. And you can't learn from an incident if I don't document the incident as I go through it. That's one of the things I beat into my team, not literally beat, but talk about all the time when we start seeing it, is we have to document everything that's happening, because I can't come back later, one, and support the actions we took, but two, I can't actually learn from it and improve our processes and walk through that if we don't talk about it and put that in there. So it's so important from an incident response standpoint that you have those forms, you have the data, you're capturing everything you're doing, and then at the end, you go back in and sit down and say, okay, what worked and what didn't? A lot of people forget this because you think you survived something when you got through the incident response, and I don't want to think about it anymore, right? But the truth is just because you survived one doesn't mean it's not going to happen a second time, right? Lightning does strike twice in the same place, and unless you fix your processes that got somebody in the first time, it's probably more likely that it's going to happen the second time, because the attackers are still sitting there knocking on the door, and they're like, oh, they kicked me out. Let me keep trying. Oh, they didn't fix that hole. Oh, I'm going to come back in and do it again, right? So you have to make sure that you learn from the things, that you have to actually put a plan in, and I'll even say it this way, put a budget in place to actually say, these are the problems, this is what started it. Okay, now here's the things I'm going to do to actually fix the problem as I walk through it. When you start looking at that, it's so important. Matter of fact, I would encourage most of you, I'm sure we have multiple different sized businesses and different things that are in here. I would make sure that you include in your disaster recovery conversations, whatever budget you have set aside for that, however you're handling it, incident response as part from a cybersecurity standpoint in that same discussion. Don't think of it as something separate. It is that important from a risk standpoint to the business as you go in. So let me ask a question here. So, anybody, let me ask a question. What questions, I'm going to ask it this way, right? As you start looking at incident response, any of you dealt with a cybersecurity case where something happened and you've got a question as to why or how it should have been handled, or when you see the results that it didn't? And I have a mic over here on the side that can walk around if you do that. But I'm curious, what kinds of things have you seen? And what worked, what didn't, as you start looking at it. And, you can share, to whatever degree you're comfortable. But I'm curious, as you start looking at it, what kind of questions kind of well up in your mind as you start thinking about it, about how to respond to these cases? Anybody?
Obviously, going through the process of an incident response, right? There's a multitude of different pieces that go into it. That first person that takes the response question, troubleshooting piece, what would be some advice for people who are taking that call to determine, is this just a normal IT, I need my password reset, there's something weird on my screen call, or is this a security incident? What's the trigger to help people understand when they need to escalate a security incident versus just a normal IT request?
Yeah, so if everybody heard that, it's basically, what is the, when I start classifying them, what's the thing that lets me know that it actually is an incident versus something else? Well, let me go way back to that policy conversation on the front end, right? So when I was talking about policies, one of the things you do in an incident response plan and the policies about it is define what an incident is. And all of us may have a different view, but when a technician receives that call, right? So let's say that, you've got somebody in one of your departments that picks up the phone, calls your IT person or whoever's supporting it and says, hey, I'm seeing this weird thing on my computer, what is it? I think the first thing is making sure that your team is trained to understand the difference between a support question and an actual something that can come onto a computer that couldn't have come there any other way than external interaction. I think that's the first thing, right? So, saying, hey, I need a new driver to make this work, that's generally not a problem. But it's also looking at the pieces and understanding, and my team does this all the time. When you start looking at it, it's like, somebody calls me, they've got a problem, something's flashing up on their system. screen's working, it's not a problem there. The operating system, they can still log in, but I've still got something weird happening that's going on. That every question should be looked at as a security question. And I think that's a. Go ahead.
I'll come back on that just a little bit to say one of the things that I combat a lot whenever I'm going through this as well is when a security incident happens, obviously we say don't reboot, we need to preserve evidence and collect those artifacts. But as an IT person, the first thing we love to say is just reboot and then see if it keeps happening, right? So in your experience working with people in SOCs and going through that, how do you train the difference between that to avoid that issue?
Yeah, well, and I think the real piece is this. It's like I said at the end. You have to train your teams to look at every issue from a security mindset. So whether they're a security technician or not, they have to be thinking, okay, what's the security ramifications of this before they take their actions? Because he was saying that you train people, IT people tend to reboot to try to get rid of a problem. Security people don't reboot because it can make a problem worse. And you have to understand that and be able to look at a problem. And I would say this, be able to know when to escalate. So it's providing your IT team the ability to be able to either escalate to more senior guys on your team or out to a vendor or somebody who can ask that question that has that cybersecurity experience on what it is. Because when we start seeing different types of attacks, right, and what they look like, they all start looking really interesting, right? So I can get into attacks that basically, everybody's used to all the ransomware payments that are paid out on the computer, right, and what they are. But most of the attackers today, the beginning of the attack is not a ransomware attack. It's stealing data. And so you may see things like, your internet starts getting slow. That might be the first, unless you have the right tools in place to see it. So if I say that to an IT guy, the internet's slow, what's their first response? Well, we need to call the vendor and find out why AT&T or whoever's, impacting my bandwidth. Or it may be that doing this, as opposed to knowing, hey, we need to look, that may be it, but I probably need to log in the firewall and look at what else is happening, or log into my other tools and see, is there something else happening on my network that I need to be familiar with? Because, if an attacker gets into your network and starts taking gigabytes of data, terabytes of data, and start uploading it to the cloud, it probably will impact your business throughput on what's going on in your network and what that looks like. So you have to understand what those differences are and make sure that your team is trained to understand that. And I think it's a critical point. It's a good point.
Sorry, I would try to yell, but...
No way.
Yeah, they want to record it, so they told me, make you wait until Wednesday.
So following the same type of thing, and my question may be a little rhetorical, but I wonder if it's overkill as well. As I've been trying to learn more about when to document different things, some of these security incidents, you may have something come into the help desk, hey, I clicked this link, I don't think anything really happened, but do you document those things? Do you document every anomaly that you see on your network where you just see bandwidth kind of go up and then you can't explain it, you go back and you check some things out, nothing seems to pan out. I've heard that you should just document all of those things, because then if something happens, you can go back and say, do these anomalies line up, or do these different things line up? Is that overkill, and especially when you have employees that you're enticing to document those things, that sometimes comes with pushback, not that I can't be a hard ass, but you want to make sure that you're not just giving extra work to do. What's your opinion on the amount of documentation that you do on those types of incidents as potential looking back on those things to see if they line up to where they're at?
So I'd answer that in a couple of ways. Obviously, the more documentation you have with the ability to search, because documentation for documentation's sake is a challenge, because then it just becomes reams of information that you can't get back to, right? So the first piece is the more documentation you have is helpful. But what I usually try to do is find ways to automate that and walk through it. So have tools, have things, because the challenge is, I agree with you, your team, you're going to have them do that, you're going to walk through it. They'll do it well for a month, they'll do it well for 2 months, they'll do it well, but then, they didn't document for 2 days. Well, then they remembered it, they went back and did it there, and then it becomes a continual problem, so that when you do need it, then the data isn't consistent enough to help you do it. So it's finding out things like on clicks, making sure you have something there that's actually documenting all the clicks that are happening on the system, so you can go back in and see that and search it and know which user did it and what that is. Because when you see an attack, it's tying it back to the point in time, what all those things are. And if you have to go back to paper, you're usually not going to be able, and paper's probably not what you're talking about, but still, if you have to go back to an Excel sheet or whatever, it becomes a very real challenge to bring all that together and do that and walk through it. So I'd say the concept, definitely. I think you need to have that kind of ability, but finding tools that will allow you to automate that and pull that together so that then you have it available to you. And then it's one of the things we do. We bring a lot of data into what are called SIMs, which are Security Incident and Event Management, what it means. But basically think of it as a large database that brings in all your logging information from all your systems into one place, so that you can search it, alert on it, build alerts, and know what's going on and all those things, so that that I'm not worrying about whether somebody just clicked on a phishing email. I'm also looking, okay, well, I clicked on a phishing email. Within 2 minutes, I also saw an IP address from, I'm gonna pick a country, India or Russia or somewhere we don't do business, right? All of a sudden come through my firewall and touch the same computer the person clicked on the phishing email and all this. So it's called correlation, where you bring all that information in together, because one piece of information, it's a concern. All that brought together paints a story that's very different than the original story, and no human can look through all the data and pull that together. After the fact, it may be something you do from an incident response standpoint, but from a detection and a protection standpoint, I want to be able to automate that and be able to alert that so that I can take action to protect the business, hopefully before something happens. Because the best steps is not having to do incident response. I'll be frank. Incident response is very necessary, and I would bet everybody in this room in one form or fashion probably will have an incident response case you'll have to work on in your career as you walk through it, if not more. The odds, the statistics are just there. But it's better to put the right pieces in place to limit the opportunity for that to happen.
Up here in the front.
I'm not sure if I'd call it incident response yet, but you get an alert from your firewall that data moving from one subnet to another has some potential. You can't find it. You get the whole team working for 3 or 4 days, there's nothing with your antivirus software or anywhere else, and you get random things like that that might happen once or twice a month. You don't have the expensive, $250,000 log everything in one place app, but you've got monitoring, you've got metrics. How do you determine what's false positives, or when do you determine, hey, this is a false positive? How much time should you spend chasing down these things as to are they actually something that occurred that we're not going to notice for a year? How do you deal with that type of behavior?
So I answer that in a couple of ways. Part of it comes down, like you said, to the tools you have, and the big word for me is visibility. When I start looking at networks. And now, one of the good news is a lot of the tools and a lot of the costs have come way down of what they've been. Like doing SIM anymore is not a $250,000 decision. So I won't go into detail there, but you can do it significantly cheaper now. It was actually probably a $750,000 decision if I went back 10 years ago. But the world's changed a little bit on where that is. But I think the first piece is having visibility. Firewall logs by themselves are good. But the problem is, it's very difficult to have what we call attribution, which is know where something comes from and what's going on with it inside just a firewall log. You got IP addresses, you've got pieces, you have to know what else is going on in the network. So the key to me is how far you take it is based on the information and how much and what you evaluate the risk as. Do you see a payload? What ports was it on? What's going on, and be able to make those decisions. Now, preferably, hopefully you're not dealing with just maybe a basic AV. Maybe you have like an EDR solution or something that's going to give you visibility not only from the firewall perspective, but now from the endpoint perspective. And hopefully it's installed on every computer on your network so that you can see, I can take the logs from that firewall, now I can compare it to what's happening there. I can see what executed on those machines at the same time, and I can start driving that back and forth and get more visibility. Because that's one of the challenges without being able to correlate across that data. You could spend on one question like that, which I'm sure you have based on what you said a minute ago. You could spend on that one piece days, weeks, investigating something that you're never able to prove because you don't have the rest of that storyline from that point in time what to do. So you drive it to what you can. To where you're comfortable with the risk that you're taking on, not driving it further, right? And then keep watching on where that is. But I would always work on broadening your visibility on what you can do and be able to give yourself the tools or your team the tools or whatever to be able to make that decision and be able to see it quickly. I know that was a little vague answer, but it depends on the specifics of that case. Anybody else? One more over here.
So we just did a procedures workshop. We're a NIST compliant environment, and when we were going through different things in all of the NIST controls we need to put in place, do things like reference NIST 800 -88 guidelines for media sanitization, and not actually include a step-by-step. I noticed, some of your guidelines have step-by-steps, checklists, etc. Would that be considered detailed enough for one of your clients?
So I would answer it this way. So hey, I would always like to drive to step because it depends on your environment, right? If you have one guy who's always going to be doing all the decisions, right, and doing all the action, and you know that he will do it the same way every time, that's great. But it's about putting pieces together to be able to really be able to execute every time the same way. So the degree to which you document, no, that's questionable, right? What's necessary to make sure that the decisions of what you need to do are the same every time. But I think as you start looking at it, you need to have something in there. So, because the guy that's doing it today, he could get hit by a truck tomorrow. Hopefully he doesn't. But the point is then somebody else has to be able to pick up and run that procedure, right? And if you don't have anything written down, you're now going back through the same process to recreate it again. Make sense?
So one of the things that I think we all experience is we all have a ticketing system, one form or another, right? Some place where we document our tickets for people who call in. In the experiences that I've had, both with litigation and legal pieces, when it comes to a security incident, they're very particular about both chain of custody when it comes to security incidents or breach. So I'm curious on your recommendation on if there should be a separate system that should house security incidents and events for ticketing purposes that has more verbose logging, because generally in my experience most ticketing systems are not really built to handle incident response.
So yes, right. So there are. So when you start looking at how you handle incident response and those things, there are definitely tool sets and ticketing systems that are specific to that make it more efficient. I'll answer it that way, right? Now, depending on what you're doing and how you're walking through it, some of you may have access to that, some of you may not, right? From a vendor standpoint, bringing in a vendor who does incident response may be able to bring that with them, some pieces there. But I would say a few key things that I would want to make sure of. If you're using your standard ticketing system that's maybe used by your teams or whatever to do it, find a way to segment those tickets regardless. Right, so be able to segment them out into a different place so that, because I'll give you a couple of reasons why. If you have, let's say you have your ticketing system and half your company has access to it, right, for different purposes, different things that are happening there and what it is. Well, some of your discovery and things that are happening as part of that incident response process, you don't necessarily want every person reading those tickets and seeing all that data while you're going through the discovery about what's going on and, oh, well, your CFO accidentally clicked on this and then sent $350,000 out to another company, and you're doing all that investigation. That's not something, depending, that you may want to share with everybody who has access to that ticketing system. So being able to secure that conversation and do it. Plus, if you do have the ability to be able to pull those things together into a separate ticketing system that's specific for incident response, that's always even another step that's improvement, because it helps guide you through how you handle what are called artifacts and things that you learn inside the process and how you store those and keep those for legal representation later and some of that. But again, not everybody has access to it, but definitely you want to be able to segment and lock down who has access to the data. And we're probably going to make this the last question because I'm probably going to have to wrap up here. I'm looking at time.
I just wanted to ask this as a general IR response or an IR plan question. You already alluded to my question in that everything that I've heard, we have not had an incident response or incident. Sorry, need that wood.
You sure you want to say this out loud?
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
So my question is that the insurance requires that you have this incident response plan. And yet one of the things that the insurance companies say is, you don't run your plan, you call us. So you give them you give them your incident response plan. My question is do you build into the plan step 1 or whatever, maybe step 2, that when you identify that you need to call the insurance company as opposed to running the next steps in your plan, should that be part of your plan? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
You know, it definitely does. And where you're going is exactly right? So one, your plan should include calling the insurance company and where that is and what you can execute before you have approval and what you can execute after you have approval from the insurance company. I would also say when you're writing the plan, and you should review, just like any other plan, you should review it regularly as you go through the process, but one time you should definitely review it is anytime your insurance changes. You should be giving copies of your plan to a point to your insurance company and sitting down and saying, what are your requirements? If something was to happen, what is that? Here's what our plan is. What do you require? And then matching those things up and going through them so that you make sure of what that is. Now, I will say, and this is, it depends on the conversation, right? So there's two schools of thought on this. One, I don't do anything until I call the insurance company. Well, that's not exactly true because the insurance company, it's like any other legal procedure, right? They have the whole average man clause, the whole, what that is, right? They want you to be doing the common things that any good citizen would do to protect their network. Right? So when you see an attack, they want you to, if shutting down your internet or blocking these computers so they can't talk to the outside world, things like that, not damaging forensic data, but stopping the ability of the attack to happen. They don't want you to sit there and say, ooh, I got to wait for my insurance company to tell me that, and I'm not going to do anything and just let this attack keep running over here on the side. Yeah, that they don't want you to do. They just don't want you to damage stuff. So it's about, being able to put the right blocks in place, identify where it is while you're getting them engaged on what that is. So your plan should deal with kind of both of those as you look at it and walk through it. All right, so thank you all for your time today. Hopefully this was helpful. I don't mind talking to anybody else as we step down from here. One thing I want to show here real quick, and I think we're going to have one more person. So a couple of things out here on your tables. You may have noticed the little cards that are out there on the table. Pearson-Kelly has put together a incident response playbook, kind of a process there that you can look at. There's a lot of different information. I would encourage you to scan those QR codes, download what's there. It's not a virus. You can go ahead and grab those things. I was joking with Mackenzie earlier about it. How many people watched the Super Bowl and saw the big QR code out there from Coinbase? I didn't remember who it was just a second ago because I couldn't remember earlier. The whole time I'm watching it, I'm like, what's the difference between a QR code on TV that doesn't say where it's going and a phishing email you get? Let's just be honest, right? But either way, thank you all very much for your time.